Hi. So finally, I'm getting to another video in this series. Um, and it may well be the last one. I think I've sort of got through all the topics I wanted to cover pretty much. But this one, a question that often comes up in terms of a non-monetary post-capitalist economy, a gift economy, whatever, is can you show us any examples around the world of where this is already being done? And like in a previous video, I talked about hybrids of the gift economy and capitalism, but the implication is to try and kind of come up with an example of a pure case, where people are running their whole lives in their communities without the use of money. And this is a much harder ask, really. I mean, one response to this is to say there are plenty of examples of organizations that run, pretty much in a non-monetary way. But even those can be examined in detail and discover some sort of monetary aspect, because we live in a global monetary economy. Okay, so like, for example, a community garden where people volunteer their labor and work together on each other's plots and share the produce, or even if they just take it, they have their own plot within the community garden and they just meet to kind of organize the whole thing, and then they take home their own vegetables and so on. It's a non-monetary organization. So there's plenty of examples like that, and I'm not going to kind of go into those. But to find a sort of example of where a whole kind of region of the world, current world or whatever, or even in the past, is being organized in this non-monetary way is more difficult. And we could look at the example of the anarchists in Spain, and even in that case, and I'm not going to talk about that because it's really complicated. But even in that case, the non-monetary alternative was kind of partial and only part of what was going on. But I think it's probably in some ways more interesting to talk about a current example and look at the Zapatista organization in Mexico, in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. As you'll see, I don't think it's a fully realized example of a non-monetary economy, although what it has going for it is that they are attempting to do this, and there are various parts of their initiatives that are relevant to this. So the first thing I'm going to say about it is whatever else you might, however else you might want to label it, you could definitely call it a temporary autonomous zone. This is the term used by Peter Lamborn Wilson, or also referred to as a TAS. And the idea is that there are examples of anarchist polities, if you like, that are set up on a temporary basis and then crumble away. I mean, like the Albanian revolution, in recent decades and so on. Anyway, so just a bit of a history of the Zapatistas. So in 1988. An organization was formed called the FLN. I think that's probably the Frontier Liberation Nacional in Mexico, and it worked in Chiapas. And this was a sort of group of Marxists inspired by Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution. And their vision of things was that there'd be a leading vanguard party, and that was them, and that they would inspire the peasants to rise up in revolution, and then the state, the revolutionary state would take control of the means of production and run them, and there'd be representative democratic sort of organization and the use of wage labor and all of those kind of things of the classic sort of democratic socialist model. And what happened to that organization was that they gradually changed their viewpoint, mostly in terms of a more anarchist political approach, which was that organizing had to come from the grassroots, from the bottom up, and that the organization that was the sort of nascent revolutionary army had to take instructions from the people. the local people, most of whom were indigenous Native American tribes from Mexico. Then they changed their name to the EZLN anyway, and are now generally known as the Zapatista Army. In 1994, at the same time as Mexico was signing the free trade agreement with the United States and I think Canada, they had a war. You know, like they started a revolution basically to take control of this part of Chiapas, this part of the Mexican state of Chiapas, and it went for only 12 days, and it reached a stalemate. And there was like the Mexican government sent in armed forces, and they were very brutal. And there were huge demonstrations in Mexico, in the cities of Mexico, that leftists opposing the government's action here, and also the Mexican government came under huge pressure from international forces of the left, you know, in countries like Sweden and Norway and Britain and so on. And in a way, the EZLN, the Zapatistas, organized a global opinion to create a stalemate, and there was a truce signed in which the government agreed to back off and allow this organization to continue to control this territory, a de facto parallel government, if you like. And probably the most important thing that this organization did to change the structure of things as they had been was to appropriate or take over huge tracts of land, like ranches, or they were called fincas. And these large landed estates are typical of much of Latin America and South America, and they're run often by absentee landlords or by a landlord family living on the site. And the local people were basically peons or you know, serfs, in a way that they were paid minimal wages and had no rights and couldn't leave the land and so on. And they took control and expropriated these people, these landlords, and they took over 500,000 hectares in total in this period of land through this, and set up an autonomous and parallel government, so over a period of time, and maintained their army to sort of defend these organizations. Despite this treaty that they signed with the Mexican government, the situation was that they would they're still being harassed and were through this whole period by paramilitary organizations. These are sort of like gangs of armed thugs set up by the Mexican government, like funded secretly by the Mexican government. And they've done things like kidnapping leaders of the Zapatistas and coming into communities and killing people, you know, like small massacres, if you like. And what happens in these situations is partly that the Zapatista army responds and drives these people out, and partly that various truces and negotiations are arranged partly through the offices of the sympathetic leaders of the local churches. And so the paramilitary and the government have never really taken back control of this part of Mexico. It's still pretty well run by the Zapatistas. That said, a lot of the people who are locals, or at least some of the people who are locals, are not sympathetic. I mean, so there's divided loyalties in the communities themselves. You can become a member of the Zapatistas kind of like by signing up, and you get various organizational duties, and you know, you have to agree to the principles of the Zapatista organization and so on. And my impression is that a majority of the population in these regions of Chiapas are Zapatistas or sympathizers as the Zapatistas, and then there's a minority who are not. And the slogan, you know, like I'm massively influenced by the book. I found this really a terrific book on the Zapatistas. It's called Autonomy is in Our Hearts. It's by PM Press, and it's by Dylan Eldridge Fitzwater. And anyway, this guy, American guy, he's already a fluent Spanish speaker. So he went to the Zapatista regions to enroll in a local school, which is basically to teach foreign sympathizers about the struggle of the Zapatistas, but also to teach them the local languages. And in his case, Tzotzil was the language that he was learning. And he says that their slogan is that what they want is the coming together of a big collective heart, you know, like filled with love for each other. And so, and the aim of their organization is to make life good for everyone. There's it's also important to realize that a founding text, if you like, a sort of textual basis for the organization of the Zapatistas is called the Revolutionary Laws, and these have been set up by the organization to represent the principles of how they operate, and I'll talk about some of these later on. So that gives it an idea of why I call it a temporary autonomous zone. But obviously it hopes to be eternal and not just temporary, and to spread to the rest of the world. One can also look at it as a hybrid of the market and the gift economy, or non-market socialism, or whatever. The community mode of production, as Anitra Nelson calls it in a recent book, Beyond Money. So let's look at some of the market aspects of it. Well, first of all, there's the interpenetration of market relations from Mexico taken as a whole, and from the global market economy into their territory, in the sense that people may have jobs in an organization which is actually a company that's also operating in the rest of Mexico and operates in the Zapatista territory. I get the impression that they talk about these companies being taxed at 10%, so implying that they are operating there, and like there's a lot of indication that small businesses are definitely operating within the Zapatista territory, and also you know, like it appears to me from what I'm reading that some of the towns and villages within their broader territory are actually still basically controlled by the Mexican government, although the majority are not. So there's a sort of interpenetration, a sort of mixed parallel government situation with the state and the market within the Zapatista territory. And there's dependence. The organization is dependent on NGO donations from rich countries. For example, you know, a rich country supplying dry toilets to communities in the villages to deal with the sanitation problems and so on. They're also community. The Zapatista organization, as part of its its own operations, has set up various kinds of cooperatives. So in some ways, the Zapatistas is not a non-monetary socialist utopia at all, but more of the solidarity socialist utopia of collectives operating to make money for the community. For example, agricultural cooperatives, a bus service, community banks, some community shops and things like that, partly funded by NGO donations from internationally, and partly self-funding as they start to operate successful market practices. What we also find to kind of control that market are local commissions to set prices and wages. For example, as I'll say in a minute, like to set equal wages for women, or a decent wage for women, and so on. And all of this leads to some typical problems in organizing local people into these kind of money-making cooperatives. I mean, every aid organization working in the global south that tries to set up cooperatives, money-making cooperatives, runs into various problems, which I've documented in great detail for Africa in some of my writing. Okay, so Those are some of the market aspects of it. But the non-market aspects of it are particularly significant. And I mean, not only are these non-market aspects present, but the Zapatistas has like a commitment to try and push the non-market, non-monetary provision as far as is humanly possible in this situation. So, okay, to start with, they've prohibited anything more than one. One family can't own anything more than 50 hectares of farming land. So what that means is that there's no possibility of large ranches, capitalist ranches, employing people at dirt wages and so on. And the other thing that's implied is because all of these farms are massively, very small farms, it means that most people are feeding themselves through their in the rural areas, at any rate, through their local subsistence production outside of the market. And I'll talk about some of that in a way. There are neighbourhood committees which decide on requests for housing. So what this means is that the capitalist market in real estate has gone down the tube and it's not operating, and that a non-market solution to housing needs is being operated and implemented. And other aspects of the gift economy, well, let's go back to the local food provision. So the non-market aspects of this are in two forms. One is local people who have de facto rights to their family plots. Like in the sense they're owned by the community, but the reality is that the de facto rights to make use of these household plots is allocated to families, and they produce for their own subsistence, for their own household provision. So that's non-market. But the other kind of non-market agriculture that's going on is communities, especially in the areas where these ranches have been taken over by the community. They also have community plots, like of huge community gardens where people go every day to grow vegetables together. And like there's a wonderful thing called Zapatistas Gardens, a documentary on this, and like it shows all of the people from the local village going to this large, it's probably about, I don't know, at least 4 hectare vegetable plot, and growing vegetables during the day, and then towards the end of the day, as they file out, they're allocated their share of the community vegetables. So that's a kind of provision in kind, direct non-monetary food provision. There are also some of the health service is free health services in hospitals, and this is also extended to people who are not members of the Zapatista organization who live locally. It's free education, which is provided by the Zapatistas in Zapatista schools. There are radio stations, which are, free-to-air radio stations set up by the Zapatistas. and like in various kinds of communication, IT technology and so on, set up by the Zapatistas, electrification and all, and so on. And so a large part of this, or almost all of it, if you like, is part of a non-market economy, a gift economy. And then probably the most crucial thing, which I'll come back to, or I don't know if it's the most crucial, but it's really important, is that the governing authorities, the democratically elected governing authorities of the Zapatista region are not paid in money, right? They're I'll come back to that, but like they're not paid in money, they're paid in kind directly, like communities kind of voluntarily supply them with various kind of gifts to make it possible for them to work as governing authorities. And it's wrong to think of this as a tax. It's more like, a donation. So now I just want to read out a quote from Dylan Eldridge Fitzwater, and he's talking about, he spent a lot of time in the Zapatista territory, and this local community that he was in, he writes, "Every day I was there, all the men, women and children went together to work in their fields, with all tasks being shared equally by men and women. In the kitchen, everyone also worked together, with men and women both participating in making the meal. So that implies a community kitchen. By far the most important source of resources in a Zapatista community is that community's own trabalhos colectivos. So like that means workers' collectives. For example, there's a maize field of 12 hectares and the workers are rotated from each municipality. And this is, so like this is at a municipality center, right? A council center. Sorry, it's a regional center. It must be a regional center. And people from each council area supply workers in rotation to work on this maize field, and the maize field is used to feed people working in the Zapatista hospital. So like they're being paid in kind, or their needs are being met directly by an organization that's voluntarily supplying them with what they need. Okay, let's also, I'm going to look at a few other issues first and gradually come to how they organize their government and make some comments on their economic organization and so on. Well, one of the difficulties, you know, like this is often, people talk about this in relationship to a non-market economy without a state. Like, okay, without a state, how do you organize to make sure that some sections of some regions, you know, like areas of your, you know, your society, whatever, are not being looked after equally. You know, they remain in poverty. I mean, you can look at this on a global scale. What about Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa? Or you can look at it on a local scale, like what about the Appalachians or Northern England, or, you know, the western suburbs in Australia or something like that. Okay, so the Zapatistas are faced by something exactly of this type, and it's interesting to see how they've attempted to deal with it. The Zapatista area, like region, whatever, that part of Chiapas can be divided into two basic sections geographically. One is the highlands. Now, the highlands people in the highlands don't have a lot of land, right? They might have small subsistence plots but around their houses, but they don't have a lot of land. And basically the way they functioned in the pre-Zapatista period was to supply migrant labor. Like people would leave the highlands and go to the lowlands to work on these large commercial estates, these large ranches owned by landlords, and be paid a pitiful minimal wage and remain in total poverty, and their communities at home would hardly have enough to buy food to eat. You know, like, tell me about, I mean, very similar to Africa in some ways, very interesting similarity there. Anyway, the lowlands, however, have a lot of land. Or I mean, obviously, because that's where you'd put a ranch, because the soil's better and so on. Okay, so when the Zapatistas took over in 1994, what they did was took over these large ranches, as I've said. And of course, so what that meant effectively was that the people who were the local people, who were basically serfs or slaves on these ranches and lived locally, they suddenly had a lot of land, and they set up these agricultural collectives, and they were selling some of their produce and feeding themselves and making a bit of money. And, you know, they could sell a cash crop like coffee or tobacco or something like that, as well as produce maize for their own food and so on, right? So this ends up by being an inequality between the highlands people, who suddenly are not being employed anymore on the lowlands estates, and the lowlands people who've taken over all this land. And one kind of way they tried to deal with it is by getting migration between regions, and so that to try and get some of the highland people to move into the lowland areas, and that was partially successful. But what also happened was that people would keep moving back to their highland home. You know, like, yeah, my highland home. Anyway, so that's one part of how the Zapatista organization, taken as a whole globally within the whole of, you know, their area, the Zapatista region, operated. The other way they operated to try and deal with this is to give a discount to the poorer regions of the highlands in terms of supplying maize. And initially this wasn't particularly effective because they ended up by getting moldy mates. It wasn't much good. And so they've kind of put a stop to that and tried to organize it more effectively. And all I'd say about this is it's a work in progress, but there's a continuous attempt to try and equalize these differences to try and eliminate these inequalities. And what's interesting about this is that this problem was not solved by a top-down decree from a central government saying, you know, you will do this, you will supply these people with maize, whether you like it or not, and so on. But it was between autonomous civil authorities in different regions to come to some kind of agreement between each other and work out how they could move ahead on this problem. I'm now going to talk about the Zapatistas and patriarchy. As will be obvious for anyone who's listened to previous talks in this series, I don't think there's any possibility of, you know, a benign classless society without an end to patriarchy, not just because it wouldn't be benign for women, but just because it would cease to function as a classless society. So what are the Zapatistas doing about that? So they have a formal commitment to equality. So this is part of the revolutionary laws that I was talking about before, the foundational text of the Zapatista organization. They have various laws to protect women. Again, part of the revolutionary law. Women are not to be forced into marriage. Women have the right to choose the number of children. They have something which wasn't traditional. They're protected against assault and rape. They have a right to a just salary, you know, a fair wage, and a right to education. So all of these are part of the revolutionary law, and they're kind of this is universal across the Zapatista territory. It's like become a member of the Zapatistas is to sign up to this set of ideas, right? There's another interesting thing, which is that they have a ban on alcohol. So if you become, you know, and I've got mixed feelings about this as an alcohol drinker myself, but in this context, what has been and can be a problem, and this is true in other parts of the world too, is that men spend the family money on alcohol. Like there's a temptation for men to go, oh, I earned this money, you know, in the cash economy, and you know, I'm going to show off by going to the bar and buying expensive imported alcohol. You know, I mean, it's not expensive by Western, you know, rich world standards, but it's locally expensive and can really eat into the family's budget, which they need for various things like buying clothes and, you know, food or whatever. Okay, so they put a ban on alcohol. You know, like you sign up to the Zapatistas, you stop drinking. They also have quotas for representation of women. You know, like women should be 50% on every governing body. And what's interesting is Fitzwater makes it really clear that in practice, it's often not that many, you know, like it might be, I don't know, 20 to 30% or something like that. And I mean, there are some places where it's 50% or even more, but it's like quite a lot of regions it's not. And he gives various explanations of this, which I think are interesting. He says women are often reluctant to take on these roles in practice. So they can be nominated to take on a governing role, an office in government, in local government or regional government or whatever. And they go, oh, you know, I don't think my husband would like that. Or I don't think I could do that because of my domestic responsibilities preclude me from that kind of time commitment. So what does that reveal? It reveals that that locally and as part of the local tradition, that men have authority and power within society, and men's power in this context is partly based on their economic power via the cash economy. They're more likely to have jobs in the cash economy and get money, but it's also due to the system of land ownership, in the sense that land ownership is passed through the male line. So like I said before, this is in the context of a broad community ownership. De facto ownership of particular plots of land is owned by families, and it's passed from father to son. You know, like, okay, not to daughter. And again, there's been suggestions, and you know, there's motions on the books, if you like, to change this landholding conventions, and they haven't been successful. So in other words, the attack on patriarchy is a work in progress too. And like I said, the end result of all of this, of men's power in the family, is that women end up with the largest part of the domestic work. So one of the other responses of the Zapatistas to deal with this is to set up women's collectives, economic collectives, to make money so that women can make money, like in weaving, embroidery, sewing, providing food at parties, in agricultural, collectives that grow coffee or whatever. And locally, what Fitzwater quotes people as saying is that women are saying, well, my husband's a bit of an asshole, but I'm rigging up my sons to be different, and to make sure that they learn how to do housework and they learn how to cook, and that they're doing an equal amount of work around the house to my daughters and all that. And my view about that is, that's a very good idea and so on. But I basically think that to really knock patriarchy on the head, and the kind of and I've talked about this in previous talks, so I won't go into it in great detail. It's really necessary for adult men to take an active role in the childcare of kids under 5. I think this is absolutely crucial to develop the kind of male psychology that's different from the present kind of patriarchal male psychology. So what I'm saying is, the Zapatistas are really working on this issue, but to my mind, that what they need to work on in particular, I mean, they could do things like setting up kindergartens and ensuring that 50% of the staff are men. That kind of thing could help. Okay, let's look at the gift economy system of justice in the Zapatistas region. I mean, this is particularly interesting in terms of the sort of abolitionism that's really current in much of the left movements, especially in North America at the moment. Okay, so abolitionists will be pleased to hear that in the Zapatista region there are no police and no prisons. And they see justice as a work of mediation. The issue is to find a solution and get both parties to be convinced that this is the right solution. So what they engineer through these mediations is reparations to injured parties. And that can be money, or it can be work. For the collective. Like for the whole community. You've done something wrong, and so now you'll do voluntary, you'll volunteer yourself or do community service, really. So there are fines and various kinds of collective work required. Now, this system of justice is organised by the locally democratically elected authorities at the local village level and at the local municipal level and so on, or the local regional level, whatever. What I mean, and now to complicate this picture, let me say this, that it seems to me from what I'm reading about it, that there's no doubt about the use of armed force against paramilitary attacks. I mean, the EZLN, the army, is there for a reason, and one of the reasons is to use armed force against paramilitary attacks. So, like, in a sense, that's a form of policing. It's policing. It's maintaining the control of local people over their communities and their government and so on, against the threat of the paramilitaries in the Mexican state taking over. So coercive violence, in a sense, is being used by the army against the paramilitary attacks, and these people are being treated as bandits. I'll come to that later too. And one of the ways that that they deal with the paramilitary threat is by setting up mediations with paramilitary organization and truces and negotiated settlements and so on, with the help of various church authorities. All right, so now let's look at the use of armed force by the Zapatistas and the army and how it operates. All right, so the army has been totally crucial in setting up this autonomous zone. I mean, the 1994 was an armed struggle, and the Mexican state would not have backed off and created a truce and dealt with things the way they did unless the army, the Zapatista army, was a credible problem for them. And what the army was able to do is to liberate territory. And the idea is that the role of the army is to liberate territory so that local people could control it. So the army is not attached to a vanguard party, which then controls local territory at all. No, it's not like that. The army sets up the situation in which local people can make their own democratic decisions about how to run their place. Now let's look at the authority structure in the army. According to Fitzwater, and I'm sure he's right, the commanding officer has final say in the army. So the army works like a normal military organization with a chain of command. And like, if we're looking at previous stateless societies, we can say that that's how they operated, in the sense that someone would become a war chief and invite other warriors to accompany them on in a war, okay, and yet they didn't have that. The war chief didn't have authority within their village or in their community to run normal life. That was done by somebody else. And the Zapatistas mirrors that kind of structure of earlier stateless societies. The Zapatista army only acts in response to requests from the elected civil authorities. And like, again, that's part of the revolutionary law. That's like foundational. The army doesn't independently make decisions about when to use armed force, only when requested. The civil authorities have the exclusive power to appropriate land, like to take land off landholders or whatever, landlords and so on, and to levy war taxes. In other words, if they want the army to do something and want to fund the army to do it, then they have to, in their local area, get people to donate money to make the, to get the army, to supply the army with funding or goods in kind that enable the army to do their work. And overall, the army is supported by voluntary donations from communities in kind, like food, etc., etc. There's another interesting thing about the Zapatistas. I mean, Weber's classic definition of the state is that the state is the body which has the monopoly of the legitimate use of armed force, right? Now, so you'd expect the ZLN, the army of the Zapatistas, to have a monopoly, a legitimate monopoly on armed force, but actually they don't. Puzzling stuff. So the regional councils also have the authority within revolutionary law, like to set up a local militia. And so there's no expectation in a way that the army is the only armed force operating within Zapatista territory for the Zapatista organization, for the Zapatista movement. It's not. It may not be. As I said before, one of the things that the army is obviously clearly involved in is trying to resist the harassment by paramilitary organizations that are funded secretly by the Mexican government. Like, for example, kidnappings of Zapatista leaders, massacres of local people who are regarded, whatever. And like, you shouldn't think that these are an everyday occurrence. That from what I can gather, they're the things that happen, every now and again, not all the time by any means. And what I suppose what you could say about this is that these paramilitary organizations are not treated as an invading army, but as bandits. Like, in other words, these are people who are not responding to the community will as a whole and are exercising force independently against the interests of the community. And the role of the army is to prevent this happening and restore the authority of the democratically elected governing bodies. Which leads me directly into the next bit. which is the various structures of government or the Zapatista civil authorities, right? So the Zapatista area in Chiapas is divided into 5 regions called caracoles. Each of these regions includes municipalities. So there's the region, then below that, the municipalities, and then within each municipality, there are communities, autonomous communities, which you could also call villages, if you like, though that gives a sort of really unnecessarily Hobbit flavor to what's going on. But anyway, they're local communities, all right? At each of these levels, they choose representatives to go to the next level, higher up, right? So at the village level, they choose representatives to go to the municipal level. At the municipal level, they choose representatives to go to the regional level. And at the regional level, I think the 5 regional councils probably meet together. I'm not sure, or do they send representatives to a further body? I don't know. Now, the process of election is a little bit different from what we're used to in rich world representative democracies. It works like this, that there's an assembly of the relevant authority, like an assembly of the municipal councillors, for example, or an assembly of all of the people living in the village, for example. And in each case, if there are a number of places, say there's 5 places, 5 representatives need to be chosen, then they'll choose 4 for each of those positions, like 4 or 5, whatever, like, so a number of options, and then they vote, like by majority vote. That's very interesting. And they select one of those 5 that have been nominated, and they'll do that for all of the 5 positions, like that. And the interesting thing about this is people don't stand for election. No one says, I want to be elected. No, it's me. I want to be deputy chair of this committee or whatever. No, that the person is nominated by their peers, right? And they say, yes, we want you to do it. And it's regarded as a duty. I mean, it is a duty. It's very taxing. A lot of work and a lot of walking about, or going about in buses or whatever, because you've got to supervise all these different regions and hang out and go and see what they're doing and so on, as I'll explain in a minute. So the post is regarded as a community service, as a duty, not like an opportunity to wield power. Okay, so that's a broad outline of the structure of government. But what also we can say about this is that the details of these arrangements are made by each unit autonomously. So this village here might have this system of election and decision making, and this one might have a slightly different one, and so on. And that applies everywhere. Like the different regions have different systems and so on. And like, this is one of the crucial things that changed when the FLN became the EZLN. Like when the Maoist, Trotskyists, whatever of the FLN became, you could say, anarchists of the EZLN. That they changed to the point of view of allowing local people in different things, and thinking that was a good idea, that they would choose the details of their own kind of democratic organization. All right. So they have a slogan: the people rule and the governed obeys. So governing by obeying. And I'll just talk about two types of that arrangement, if you like. Okay, so in one type of situation, the authorities at one level may believe that there's some issues coming up, and then they might decide on propose an agreement to deal with these, like landholding disputes, or funding the army, or dealing with an international NGO or whatever, right? And they come up with a proposal. So, okay, so that could be, let's say it's at the municipal level, right? And the municipal representatives are working on behalf of all of these villages, right? And they come up with a proposal for these villages to reach an agreement. This is a really interesting term. Fitzwater uses the term agreement. And I think it's fascinating that that in terms of the not beyond money stuff of theories of Anita Nelson, that she talks about compacts, you know, right way back when she's talking about non-market socialism in 2011, she talks about compacts. And so these are essentially compacts in her sense, in the sense that they're agreements between people to operate in a particular way. All right, so point one again, going back to it. The authority at a particular level suggests an agreement for the area under their authority. And then the representatives go back to the communities until they can come up with a consensus for all of these communities. And sometimes a majority is enough, and sometimes they feel like they need a consensus. All right, it depends. There's no definite rule about that. Okay, so you can see that the government's ruling by obeying. You know, okay. So what's happening is that the government, you know, in let's say the municipality in this example, comes up with an agreement, and then goes back to make sure that everyone's happy with it. And if they're not, if you know, like Village X is not happy with it, they rewrite the agreement to fit together villages A, B, C, D, and with X, so that everyone is happy with that. So in a sense, what we have is a negotiated agreements where the role of the municipality, the elected representatives, is to facilitate this process of making compacts. That's what their role is. Now, once an agreement has been made, the role of the authorities is to monitor the agreement in their patch. You know, they have to make sure that this agreement is being maintained. And then this is really interesting. What happens if an agreement is not being maintained? Village X just starts doing the other thing that they're not meant to do within this agreement. You know, like, for example, they engage an NGO, which is, I mean, the NGO is only meant to work with the municipality so that everyone's equal in relationship to the NGO, but the NGO starts working with Village X, and Village X turns a blind eye to the fact that this doesn't fit with the agreement, right? That could be an example. But what happens then? Now, if it was like a top-down representative democracy, what would happen then is that the Village X would be sanctioned and made to come into line, if necessary, by force. That's how a state, even a representative democratic state, operates. No. That's not what happens here. What happens here is that the municipal authorities scratch their head. Oh dear, this is not working. And they go back to the villages to try and work out another agreement that everyone's going to be happy with. All right. So this is why it's like a non-market socialist political arrangement, in the sense that what we're doing is negotiating agreements between autonomous parties, whether that's at the village level or the municipal level, the regional level. All right, let's look at the second way in which this may happen. It's similar, but it's just it's an interesting wrinkle. Okay, so citizens in one or more communities may ask for a development project to be engaged in. You know, like we want you know, a local hydro based on a dam in our creek on a hill near in our municipality or whatever. The Good Government Council will then meet with local councils and committees to find out the nature of the need, so that then the governing body, which is responsible for this particular part of the community or part of the Zapatista region, will go back, will send representatives to go back and find out what's going on, and do they really need it, and what will be the cheapest way to do this, and and who can we get to fund this, and all this sort of stuff, right? And then they may be able to find a global NGO willing to fund this if they think it's a really good idea, a good project, or to help make local funding available. So again, this is, and like I couldn't get over this, but it's like exactly like the Chikukwa project, which my sister and I've made the film about in 2013. That's exactly what the leaders of the Chikukwa project said. We do not tell people what to do. We wait for local people to make proposals to us, and then we discuss whether we think those proposals we can do something about that or not, as the case may be, and try to implement what's being suggested. So that's exactly how this operates. Again, really typical of how a non-market socialist economy could work. All right, let's look at some more things about the way the governing authorities, the civil authorities operate. Well, the first thing is that they're not paid. They're not paid in money. Instead, local bodies provide them with assistance in kind, which can be food, like that's an obvious thing, you need food, right? So, and you're not working on your own land a lot, or it can be work done on their fields, like so someone from the local community volunteers to take on the work that they can't do because they're doing the governing work. If the civil authorities think that a project needs to be done, they decide that a project, should be done and so on, they can get funds from solidarity NGOs, like international NGOs that are supporting the Zapatistas. Or another thing they do is they tax companies which are operating, which is sort of global or Mexican companies operating within the Zapatista territory. They tax them at 10%, apparently. Or they can use funds created by local collectives. So, local. So say a particular municipality wants a dam. All right, let's use the dam. And they need concrete and, a few other things, right? Okay, to make the dam. Well, that costs money, and they don't produce concrete locally, so they'll have to buy it from somewhere else in Mexico, from a government or a local supplier who's actually part of a Mexican chain of concrete companies or whatever. So what are they going to do? So one of the things that they can do is that they have a local Zapatista collective growing coffee, and they're selling their coffee on the world market, and they're getting money for that, and they'll use that money to fund the dam. So the role of the civil authorities, in a sense, to make these arrangements and fit these pieces of the puzzle together. The role of the civil authorities is to mediate with solidarity NGOs and government. In other words, like I said before, in order to prevent favoritism for particular communities who manage to hook up with a particular NGO, international NGO, or favoritism from government or whatever. Like they try and avoid getting any support from government because they think it comes with strings attached. But a solidarity NGO, yeah, okay. And the aim is to prevent favoritism and local elites making deals with outside bodies. So what they'll do is they'll say, if you want to do something in our region, then you've got to come to the regional good governing council and talk to us about it. And then we'll decide, with consulting the communities, what we're going to do. Again, this is so similar to the Chikukwa project. Like they didn't take funds from international NGOs for the first 5 of their years of their operation, and then when they did, they insisted that they come to the elected local body to work out how to do that. There's a separate organisation which monitors corruption issues and oversees the use of the government funds. So this is a bit of a puzzle. I'm not quite sure how this body is appointed, but I'm getting the impression that it's appointed by the Zapatista members acting as a party almost. Like it. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure, but it seems to me like they're regarded as independent arbitrators in that sense, and they're there to make sure that the revolutionary laws, if you like, are being implemented, and that the local governments haven't been taken over by a corrupt elite, whatever. Various other things make this unlikely. One is that authorities are elected, like say you're elected for 3 years and you're an authority in the local, like you're a councillor in the municipality and you're elected for 3 years, you won't actually be serving that time. You might be serving for 2 weeks and then you're off for 5 weeks, and then you're serving for 2 weeks, then you're off for 5 weeks. So everyone's doing that. So these positions are rotated. So like if they need 10 people on deck, they'll elect 30, and then the first 10 will serve, and then the next 10, and then the next 10, and so on. The effect of this is that people who are on the government, at any level, at the regional level or the municipal level or the local level, are going back into their communities to work on their own fields and produce their own food for their families most of their time in office. Okay, now this is 7 principles for the civil authorities, which I'll just read out. Serve others, not oneself. Represent, not supplant. Build, not destroy. Obey, not command. Propose, not impose. Convince, not defeat. And go below, not above. So there you go. Okay, so now I'm going to embark on some reflections on all of this. Okay, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Zapatista economy. Okay, so to me, in a sense, this is an organization which is pretty strongly committed to a non-monetary economy, and yet they're unable at the moment to implement that in their region. So what that indicates is the difficulty of setting up a temporary autonomous zone that is totally non-monetary when your local region depends on an external market economy for some supplies. For example, or supplies for hospital equipment because they run their own hospitals, right? Power equipment because they run their own electricity production and so on. Like computers, laptops, whatever, mobile phones and so on. They do radio broadcasting, so they have various Zapatista radio stations in the communities. Again, you need equipment to do that. The buses that they use, they have local transport systems run by the Zapatistas. The weapons that the army's using, stationery, office stationery for making all of these civil authorities work and so on. Water purification, like cement, even if you're making a large water tank with local bricks and cement, you still need cement. And so the way Zapatistas solve this problem is by setting up local cooperatives to make money, and also by allowing various local businesses. This obviously works to some extent, but it's not without its downsides. Like in the market monetary economy has a terrible habit of colonizing and kind of taking over. And you've got to constantly deal with that, and it's not an ideal situation. And there are also problems in depending on NGOs for international assistance. Partly because ultimately the donors from these NGOs make various kind of stipulations and want to make sure that their money is being spent in a way that makes sense to their members. Like let's say it's a church organization in Germany or something like that. It's donating money to the Zapatistas. Well, the members of that church want to make sure that the money's not going to sort of create feather beds and hammocks for rich Zapatista warlords or something like that. So they're inevitably they're supervising what the money's being spent on, which means that local people are not totally making these decisions. They're partly being made by the NGO. So this is like intrinsic to this kind of situation is that. So what? And of course, these donations of money are also coming from the capitalist market economy taken globally, in the sense that the members of the German church are working in jobs for wages and putting some of their money into this. So, I mean, what at a basic level, what you could say is we need to internationalize the gift economy, or at least make it big enough to allow kind of technically sophisticated products, or even like cement and barbed wire and so on, to be made within the region controlled by the non-market economy. An alternative solution to the one that the Zapatistas are using could be this, that they just close the borders and they say no market operations within our borders. What we're going to do is barter, with international suppliers. So they're going to say to the people supplying cement, okay, we can't pay you in money because we don't use money here, but we're going to pay you in coffee. And then you'll have to, deal with the marketing of that in your own, like you'd say it's Mexico. Within Mexico City, you can, we'll bring the coffee to you in our bus to Mexico City, and you'll have the warehouse full of cement, and we'll take that back in our truck, back to the Zapatista territory. So there are ways to kind of to deal with this, which would perhaps be able to insulate the non-monetary economy more as a temporary autonomous zone. I'm not saying that these are necessarily the best option or anything. I'm just speculating about, what the options may be. The difficulties that the Zapatistas are facing here are very similar to those with many other aid projects in the global south. So their aim is to set up a local cooperative that is going to produce a market product that they can sell internationally and within Mexico more broadly. And like in many cases, to do that, you both need equipment and supplies from outside, and you need expertise locally. And you end up by using machinery which needs to be constantly maintained and resupplied and kind of looked after. And that also, for a start, that implies a degree of training and technical expertise, which may not be present in some of the communities and villages in question, because they probably didn't go much past primary school in many cases. And it's like, as well as that, you need a part for something, and you've got to get that part. You've got to source that part from somewhere else and know how to, to order it in and all this sort of stuff. And what can happen? I mean, and this is not just here; it's in every aid project. Is that the NGO, rushes in and donates a piece of machinery, and then when you want to sort out the part, you suddenly find that unless you're making that you've got to buy that on the international market. It's not being supplied by the NGO. And often the NGO will say, well, you're meant to be, this is meant to be a money-making cooperative, so you should be making the money to replace this part. And it's like often the money that you're making is actually being used by local people to such an extent that there's no money left over for this. If you're talking about people who are kind of on the borderline of poverty, on the breadline, of poverty, then often the money gets spent on something really essential, like, I don't know, school uniforms or cooking oil or cement for the dam, or like it's inevitable. It's very hard to save money in this situation. So I noticed that Fitzwater mentions various kinds of projects which have started in the Zapatista region, which were aimed to create money-making cooperatives. Okay, and have run into these kind of problems. And he mentions a bus service, okay, a rice husker, in other words, a machine for husking rice so that you can sell husked rice after growing it, a shoemaking business, which uses electric sewing machines and so on, obviously, a blacksmithing. So I don't know, I mean, it depends what equipment is required for that and so on. and what sort of supplies are required for it, and what level of expertise is implied implicit in the idea, and so on. And also you've got to look at the situation of markets. Are these things really marketable, especially from a remote area? I mean, how much is the cost of transport across dirt roads to get it to Mexico City to market it? You know, like these are all problems, and it's like capitalist businesses constantly solve these problems. The minute you've got a sort of community cooperative, well, you know, it can solve these problems too, but it's like what can happen is what can happen to any capitalist business is that they can go broke, and they can make a mistake, and they can think that a particular project is a money spinner when it actually isn't, and so on. So it's like there are huge problems with the market economy that operate on the Zapatistas just like they do on any other Global South NGO project. So what Fitzwater also observes is that the kinds of cooperatives that were doing really well are those where local knowledge and equipment is totally sufficient to make the operation work. So, for example, the cattle industry, because, you know, in a sense, that's what some of these ranches were for before they were taken over by the local people. So you know, that's viable. Growing maize, I mean, that's something they also do for their own subsistence. So selling maize, but of course, you're working very hard and not making a lot of money doing that if you're not mechanized. Growing coffee, that might be a better option. That's certainly done in many regions of the Global South. And of course, these Global South producers of coffee compete with each other and drive the price down to where you're not making a lot of money. Ecotourism, well, you know, it depends on how you know, what level of comfort the tourists expect, I suppose. Okay, so that's one sort of raft of problems, and look at sort of things that work and don't work. And then you've got the classic problems of the market economy, is that the minute people start making money, they develop private interests in maintaining their control over this money as against the interests of the rest of the community. For example, Fitzwater mentions a case where they set up a health bank, which was meant to be like that you would apply for a loan if you needed supplies from the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico, which locally could not be supplied, and you'd have to pay the local pharmacy money to get the supply. Okay, so there's a bank which provides you with a loan, and the local municipal authority was meant to ensure that anyone who was applying for a loan from this bank was actually going to use the money for a genuine medical purpose. And what happened was that the local municipal authority started giving mates favors, you know, like, okay, well, we know this is actually to set up your shop, but well, we're going to pretend that you know, your grandmother had a stroke and get pharmaceuticals for that. And so, yeah, I mean, so they controlled that kind of excess. But let me just say that this is exactly the problem with the market monetary economy that I've talked about in earlier talks. It's no surprise that you run into problems, because that's what a market economy does. Okay, so another thing is high-tech international solutions get seen as modern. You know, like the global culture of modernity and industrialization is so hegemonic that it's no surprise that people in villages think that the high-tech solution is the real one, and that anything low-tech that can maintain at a local level is not to be preferred. And that means you're constantly driving into the sort of problems I talked about before about maintenance. Now, here's a classic example from Fitzwater's book, which is that he was staying in a house that had built a water. No, I think they'd been supplied with a water tank. This is very interesting. Probably a big plastic water tank, maybe 500 litres, right? And they found, as many people in the Global South find, that The 500-litre water tank wasn't actually enough for their family to get the drinking water they required, because people are also using it for washing and God knows what. And like, yeah, and not to mention the house isn't that big, so you're not getting a lot of water off the roof, and maybe the guttering doesn't work that well this year, and you can't afford a new a galvanized iron gutter and fittings, or you don't know how to put it up, or all of these things happen all the time. And guess what happened? So he says, oh well, they were still having trouble with water, like not getting potable water that was sanitary, that was free of microbes or whatever. So they were waiting for an electrically powered water purifier to be organized by the Zapatistas, and that depended on, and don't forget this, on electrification of the village, which was also a promise of the Zapatistas, that they'd get that. I've seen this sort of stuff roll out so many times in Africa, you like, whoa. But it's like, okay, so what they could have done instead, and this is, my advice, a low-tech solution would have been to put up a large open-air building, just like with posts in the ground and with a thatched roof, and using some old corrugated iron and bending it up and tying it together at the top with a piece of wire, so that as the water drains off the thatch and drips off the end, it flows in this corrugated iron, one sheet overlap with another, into a tank. And what's the tank made out of? Locally fired bricks made out of local clay and mortar and cement. So what's the only thing you need to buy for that? A bit of cement to hold the whole thing together. And it will last forever, and it can be repaired with cement whenever it goes wrong. And the corrugated iron can be painted with some sort of waterproof oil or real paint or whatever, and constantly maintained, and it'll work for a long time, and you can keep replacing the thatch. Now, that's an extremely low-tech solution, and a lot of local people would probably find it, like daggy, primitive, etc. Compared with an electric water purifier, I mean, what's not to like? So all I'm saying about that is that it's not. It's like, it's typical of the Zapatistas don't, like, it's because it's a temporary autonomous zone. You tend to think, oh, things are really different here. Well, when I start to look at it in detail, I'm finding some of the same issues that come up with African food security projects. Okay, the next thing I want to look at to finish off this talk is the state and the gift economy. Okay, so there's an argument that there can be no state within a non-market gift economy, community mode of production, you name it. Why not? Haha, I'm glad you asked. So a representative state depends on paid enforcers who implement the will of the majority as defined by their elected representatives. So the state has to have a monopoly of violence, right? The elected representatives elect, they tell the army or police what to do. And why do the police and army obey them? Because they depend, because being in the police or armed forces is a job. It gives you economic security. And the rest of the population are also after, looking for a job. This is a job, among others. This is in the rich capitalist economies, but in previous class societies of the ancient past, like Roman Empire and so on, a lot of the other majority of the population are actually slaves, and they'd love to be in the army. You get paid and use that money to buy food, and you're well set up. So it's like, no wonder the army or police force, as the case may be, does what they're told, because the alternative is either, not having access to food, full stop, or not having access to money to buy food, as in current society. A gift economy doesn't operate like that, right? People are supplied by communities, and they don't need to obey state directives to get access to goods and services. So every community, like in the gift economy that I've talked about in previous talks, I mean, they're largely self-sufficient, so they're supplying a lot of their food and housing and furniture needs and clothing and so on and so forth. But as well as that, they're also being supplied by gifts in a system of exchange and compacts agreements with other communities. And as I said, this can be quite technologically complex if there's a chain of gifts from one, people digging up the iron ore to people making the steel, to people making rails, to people making the trains, people running the train service and so on. It can become quite complex. But at the end of the day, no one is depending on an income in that sense, a job where they have to do what they're told. No one has to do what they're told. They voluntarily produce stuff and make agreements with other producers as to how things should be run. So there can be no paid enforcers in a gift economy. No one has any motive to do what the government tells them. There can be no police force in that sense. So there can be no state. So there can be no legitimate monopoly on violence, right? And that's like the anarchist, if you like, the anarchist position. That's the anarchist. That's the reason why, if you think a non-monetary gift economy is the way to go, that you might end up supporting the anarchist view that there can be no state. What I want to say about that is it's really interesting how the Zapatistas get around this or deal with this, or how their situation develops, because it's like a state that is not a state. It's a state that's kind of so much not a state that it's like it's compatible with a gift economy, and it's a political or civil organization that has authority within the structures of a non-monetary economy. It's a state that's not a state. So, okay, so let's go through that in detail. The government represents the consensus at each level of government, right? So the aim of the elected municipal leaders is to find out what the consensus is and the agreement between their various local communities, and to represent that back to them in the form of an agreement or compact, right? And obviously there are more detailed regulations at more local levels where people can, have to agree on the details, and at broader levels there's less, the regulations are less detailed. There's consensus, but maybe over less defined areas, let's say. Let's call it the government with quotation marks. What the government does in the Zapatistas territories is act as the repository, the place where things are held, and the monitor, in other words, the people who watch over and make sure of agreements and compacts that are territorial in scope. Okay, so the municipal government looks after the municipality. The regional government looks after all of the municipalities together. The organization right up the top, it's the municipality, the regional government, the 5 regional governments meeting together to work out policy for the Zapatista territory as a whole. In each case, the authority of governments is about agreements which need to be made in that area, to define that area. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest here is that there are 2 different kinds of compacts in the gift economy. One is compacts which have to be maintained in a given area. Another is compacts between organizations which don't necessarily have to be within a particular area. So, okay, so let's look at, the Bird Observers Club, right? There can be a chapter of the Bird Observers Club in each municipality, and they meet as the Bird Observers Club, but government doesn't need to supervise what they do as the Bird Observers Club. They can meet and make agreements with each other about how they're going to do this, and compare notes and, do scientific research or whatever. That's all fine. Similarly, the people running the train network, you know, like I talked about before, these are all organizations in different communities. They have agreements with each other and da. But the municipality needs to be able to say, well, we want the train line to run here. We want the station to be here, da. That's an agreement that has to be made within that territorial unit. The democratically adequate way of defining that agreement is through an assembly or political process, if you like, within that municipality. And other municipalities don't have to worry about that part of it at all, because it's not their station, it's not their, you know, the train line, it's not going through their land and so on. So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm looking at here. I'm saying, okay, two kinds of compacts. One is kind of, if you like, lateral compacts between different organizations, and the other is, if they're not lateral, what are they? But they're sort of local, let's call them local compacts within particular areas. And what the Zapatista government does is set up the compacts that are local to particular areas, defined territorially in relationship to each other. Right. There is no monopoly of legitimate violence in the Zapatista region, you know, the Zapatista controlled area, because, as I said before, local governments can also set up their local militias. Also, the army, which there is a Zapatista army, it's not the paid enforcer of government decisions, right? That decisions are made. They're not paid for a start, you know, right? In other words, their motive for being in the army isn't that they're going to get a secure income or whatever. Instead, they're receiving donations from the community. So they're supported like any other part of the community by community donation. You know, just like, okay, so you're a villager who needs some chicken wire for your chicken coop, whatever. And your municipality has an agreement with the people producing chicken wire to supply you with chicken, to supply the municipality with chicken wire and distribute it according to need in the villages, whatever. So you're being supplied by donations, you know, and through agreements and compacts. Same thing with the army. The Zapatista army is being supplied by donations of food from the various communities, you know, which the army supports and looks after. The governments, you know, like at different levels in the Zapatista region, don't use armed force to ensure the payment of their officers, right? So the government is not sending out the police to make sure you pay your taxes. Instead, what's happening is that people in their local villages, they're deciding to supply goods in kind to the government officers to enable them to continue their work on behalf of the community. So in conclusion, the operation of government in the Zapatista controlled area is like that of any voluntary club organizing some aspect of production. They're doing a work of service to the community. You know, they're not that different in economic structure to the group of villagers who go together to the fields every morning and work on their community garden to produce vegetables for their community. They're supplied by community donation. They're working on behalf of the community and so on. So I found that a very interesting way of looking at the Zapatistas. I mean, I think a lot of people, when faced by the sort of anarchist view of the state, you know, recoil in horror, not to put too fine a point on it, and like it in a way you can understand that, because in a sense they're saying, well, you know, what organization is looking after the territorial needs of particular communities And how is that compatible with a gift economy in which everyone, forms voluntary clubs and does whatever they think is useful and negotiates with other voluntary clubs to produce stuff and pass it around the community? And my answer has always been, well, that's not a particular problem. It's like, the people who are affected by the operations of a particular club, get together an organization to liaise with that club to make sure they're not causing trouble. Like the people farming a particular area go, well, you can't run your train line through here, so we'd better negotiate with someone else, in another area of our region to do that. And in a way, that's one answer. I'm not saying that isn't an answer and it wouldn't work, but all I'm saying is that the Zapatistas have created a different kind of answer to that question, which is sort of interesting in a sense, and maybe useful in propaganda terms, because you're able to say to people, well, we could run a gift economy without a state, in the kind of state that Weber talks about, that we all know how it operates and so on, with a kind of state that's not a state, and that's what the Zapatista organization is attempting to set up. And I kind of like that idea. Okay, so I'll leave that with this. What I'm going to do next is probably put all of these YouTube channel videos onto podcasts, probably with Podbean, I think it's called, something like that. So we'll see how that goes. And then after that, probably what I'm going to do is go through this and write it up and try and get a book out of it. We'll see. I don't think I'm going to. Oh, look, I might have another video left in me, but relative to this, but I'm not sure. And I think probably what I'm thinking of calling my podcast series is Anarcho-Feminism Now, which I have some hesitation about, because as a man, I don't regard myself as a feminist so much as a supporter of feminism. On the other hand, if you've listened to these talks, you'll know I talk about feminist theory heaps, and I think it's really important. So we'll see, but that's my current thinking on it anyway. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye. See you all later.